Hello and welcome to another video lecture from Mr. Watkins at mrwatkins.com. This particular video is going to be covering evolution. This should be the first of the series of lectures in evolution. I'm going to try and frame how evolutionary theory was developed. Now there's a lot more, a whole lot more than what I'm going to give you. The idea here is just to give you a very general, very basic, very broad understanding of the different ideas about evolution, about how flora and fauna, how organisms evolved or began and became what we see today. So let's go ahead and get started here. So what we're basically wanting to look at is the history that we have of this idea. And please remember that we are looking at this from our perspective as humans in a natural world, and it's hard sometimes to pull ourselves away from that particular mindset. And so let's just look at what the history is, what the philosophers, what mankind has kind of said has happened on this planet over the course of time. So I'm going to draw some axes here, and here's another axis. And as soon as the webcam will get into focus here in just a moment. There we go. This y-axis, this is going to be time. And so this little mark up here, this is today. Doesn't matter exactly when that is, just know that it is today. And then this is going to be the type of organism. Now later on, or you may already have studied or talked about in your class the types of organisms, and we're talking about things like fish and dogs and plants and trees and all of those kind of things. This origin here is before planet Earth was here. So all philosophies have some type of creationism, creation story in them. It doesn't matter, even the giant spaghetti monster, the Church of the Giant Spaghetti Monster out of California, they have a creation. How did it begin? How did the planet begin here? And we're not going to deal with that here. What we're going to talk about is when the organisms showed up or came to what we see today. And so there is a school of thought, it's a very old school of thought, that there was some point all the organisms were created. So what we see today are the same organisms that we saw, the same types, the same thing that were there in the beginning. And there are still people that believe in this, and there are people who don't think this is the right way that things happened on this planet. But this is a very old idea, very old concept, very ancient concept. We also have another concept that the organisms that we have today, okay, so here's our type of organisms that we have today, are not all the organisms that were on the planet whenever it began. So here, there's no extinction. These people, this philosophy, there is no extinction. In fact, in the 1700s, 1800s, there was some talk about how the fact that this particular philosophy, fossils that were found were considered demons or evil creatures that had died, and they were not from this earth, they were heavenly bodies, or that these creatures, these things that you see, were put in here to cause a problem for the belief system of the devoted. And so there was some real discussion here about how this actual model would work based on seeing the extinct animals or the fossil records. There were some people as well, a philosophy that said, majority of the organisms that we see today are here, but we have had some times when these organisms died off, that they're no longer here. And so we end up having this issue of, well, how did they die? And one of the classic ways that people discuss this issue is they say, well, the bottom line is, you had some catastrophic events. Let's talk about the flood in the Bible as one of them. There's other religions that have certain catastrophic events that occurred in their histories. And so what they're saying is that some of these organisms didn't survive because there was this event that caused them to go extinct, to die off, or to be selected to die off. So this is also another philosophy as well. Cuvier, the father of anatomy, is one that promoted at least part of this. He was one that we attribute, at least in Western society, to having said, animals go extinct, guys. Look, here's the fossil record, and I can point how this structure looks just like this other structure. We move a little later on, and we have a gentleman named Careless Linnaeus. He Latinized his name, and so he's basically known for his description of the different kinds of animals, setting up that system that we use today. But he also talked about something that Lamarck had brought up. And so let's move on to Lamarck and look at what he had. And his big thing was that organisms that we have now have changed over time and have become different organisms. Now, he couldn't describe why necessarily that would happen, or at least the way we know it. But what he did say is that these organisms were one thing way back in the beginning, and over time they acquired characteristics. These characteristics caused them to change. And so that, say, the giraffe was an example that he used in his book. The giraffe had a shorter neck way back in the day, but as they stretched to reach those top leaves, those branches to eat, what ended up happening was their necks got a little longer over their lifetime. And when they had offspring, those offspring had inherited that acquired characteristic and now have a longer neck. And so after generation and generation of these longer necked, the necks getting longer, we see the giraffe that we see today. And he used examples like this, and he also talked about selective breeding. We know that we can put two or animals together, the same species that have desirable traits that we want, and we can select for those traits by having them breed, and then the offspring that have the traits that we like, we allow those offspring to breed, and so eventually you can end up getting offspring that when they breed, they will naturally have the characteristics that we want. I mean, just look at dogs and look at cats. We have so many varieties of these particular organisms. So Lamarck thought that these characteristics were acquired in a lifetime, and today we can absolutely refute that. If you'll remember back in genetics when we discussed Gregor Mendel, he basically set up a system. Now, granted, it didn't get discovered for a while, but he set up a whole system where we figured out that these characteristics are inheritable through the DNA, through the genes. You also need to understand that there was a lot of pressure on a lot of these people, these men that were coming up with these ideas, because it flew in the face of the religious people at the time, some standard ideas that have been held over, at least in Western society, from the time of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and so there was some real challenges that they were placing on what was considered dogma at the time. So then we come along to everyone's favorite person. You say the word evolution, and the first person everybody thinks about is Charles Darwin. And let's look at kind of what Charles Darwin had said. Darwin didn't completely have it right. He again, didn't know Mendel's work. Mendel and Darwin, although I think they overlapped a little bit in their time frame, they really didn't know each other that well, or at all, if I understand correctly. And it really wasn't until the turn of the century, the 1900s, when you had guys like Ernest Mayr and Haldane and Sewell, these guys, with the discovery of that, kind of blended Darwin's ideas. But the idea here is that, and we're going to skip right up to what we have now, is that an organism, that there is some common ancestor, that from this common ancestor we had the changes that occurred, but not all the organisms changed. Some of the organisms in a population would change, and over time some of those organisms would change, and maybe they'd move into a little different part of the environment that they're in. And so as they changed over time, they developed characteristics, and those characteristics made them look a little different. And if you think about the time frame that we have here on the planet, that there's been a lot of time that's occurred since this first common ancestor, this first organism began. Let me put my stuff here real quick. And so that we still get this kind of Lamarckian idea, except, we're not going to say it's acquired characteristics. There's some heritable factor, which we know is DNA, that is being changed as it's being passed on from offspring to offspring. And what we're seeing then is that these organisms are radiating out or diverging. And so that there's been these organisms they were trying to changing together, and then some event or some accumulation of change occurred enough to where we now have two populations, and so we now have two different types of organisms. And there may have been an extinction as we went through, and some of these organisms here all kind of divided because there was pressure in that environment. There was pressure that some of the organisms were better able to survive. Some of the organisms, because they had traits, they had developed traits, or they had adapted to the environment, that they were better able to survive in that environment. I'll give you an example, and I'm going to use Lamarck's giraffe example. If there was a population of giraffes, not all of them would have the same length of neck. There would be variation, a very key piece that you need to understand for evolution. And remember that variation comes from mutation and recombination again in meiosis. And so that variation is essential for this to occur, so that not all the giraffes' necks are the same height. So let's say in a particular environment that there is a drought, and so some of those giraffes, they're all able to get the lower branches, but the ones with the longer branch can probably get more leaves, have a better chance to survive, and if they do, they have a better chance of being able to survive and produce offspring. And because their neck was a little longer and that trait was found in the DNA, it was inheritable, then their offspring's neck should be a little longer. Now granted, not all of them are going to be, because you're still going to have mutation and recombination. But over the course of generation and generation, this longer neck, as long as there's pressure, as long as there's natural selection that has that pressure that selects for the longer neck, then that particular gene combination will be selected for and will occur more frequently in the population. And that's all we're saying here, is that evolution, the change in organism from generation to generation, just continues to occur, and so that we eventually get a new species. So let's define species. Species is quite simply a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce offspring that can also interbreed. We usually say they're viable, in other words, they can live, and they live a life, and produce viable, fertile offspring. So in other words, those offspring can also produce. Okay, so that's where that species concept comes in. It is a constructive man. There is no question about that. In fact, all of this is kind of a constructive man. But the idea then is that we're looking at species here, not necessarily kind or types, but we're looking at species here, and those species change because there's variation, not just in their genetics, but there's variation in the environment they're in. So when you look at like Darwin's finches came over from the coast onto those group of islands, and when they got here, they found that there was a whole chain of different islands. Each one of these different islands, I am so bad at drawing, each one of these different islands had a little bit different environment. So when those group of finches came over and they settled on the different islands, they had different environments, different selection pressures, and so you saw that mutation recombination occurred to give variation in the population. Some of the changes were beneficial for certain parts of the population and they survived, some were not and they did not survive. And so that you get this radiation, not just a split, but an actual radiation out from from that population into the different groups, because of all of the pressures and all of the randomness and all of the things that were going on within those different islands right off that coast. Hope this helps you with your understanding, and we will see you in class.